My name is Rod Dreher. I am a fellow here at the Danube Institute, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be asked to comment and to discuss the film with you, Travis, because not only is this an extremely important topic, but it's also something that intersects, I hate to use that word in this context, but it intersects with a lot of my work. I wrote a book called Live Not by Lies. Thursday night here at the Danube Institute, we're going to be screening the first episode of the documentary film made about it. And one of the things that jumped out at me from this film was Buck Angel. When I was in Prague interviewing a woman, Kamila Bendova, she and her late husband, Václav, were the only Christians in the inner circle of the Czech dissidents around Václav Havel. And they were both very serious Catholics, and most of their colleagues at the top of the movement were not religious at all, and not even conservative necessarily. So I asked her once, Kamila, was it difficult for you and your husband to work with people who were very much unlike you? She said, no, not at all, Rod. The thing you have to remember when you're standing against totalitarianism is the most important thing to look for in allies is courage. She said, you mustn't think that our fellow Catholics had courage. Most of them kept their heads down to avoid trouble just like everybody else. But my husband and I, as Catholics, felt that we couldn't do that. We had to stand up. And when we looked around for the people who would stand with us, we saw these hippies. There was even a former Trotskyist in their group. And she said, today when we're fighting soft totalitarianism, and I would say trans ideology is a form of that, we can't afford to pick and choose our allies based on whether or not they share all of our priors. So somebody like Buck Angel is a perfect example of what Kamila was talking about. We don't have to agree with the way Buck Angel chooses to live his life, her life, but this person is clearly an ally. And I was so moved by the final minutes of your film in which she wept, because this is clearly something so close to Buck Angel's heart, and Buck Angel has been willing to suffer for that truth, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I've gotten so much flack for having Buck in the film, as I mentioned to you yesterday, by people who would otherwise agree with, 98, 99% of what I have to say or what the film says. Even some of the stuff in the film that Buck says I don't fully agree with. I don't really think that gender dysphoria is a condition in which anyone needs these surgeries. I think there are other paths out of it. We can have that disagreement, that's fine, but Buck is clearly interested in protecting children and is interested in going against the ideology. And so the fact that there are huge swaths of people, often just called gender critical, or sometimes they call themselves TERFs, or other people call them TERFs, that...
trans-exclusive radical feminists.
Correct, yeah. And the fact that they exclude people like Buck, and therefore people like me, and people like Stella that you've seen in the film, who puts on conferences, and it does some of the most that anyone has ever done to push against this. And they exclude us and criticize us and saying that we're, causing children harm. It's really depressing. So I was already depressed making the film because it's a depressing topic, and I had to look at all those pictures and talk to all these people and go into gruesome detail about this stuff. So that was already heavy. And then when I did a showing of this film, I did a private screening at one of the Genspect conferences, and had all these people basically ridiculing me, saying I shouldn't put Buck in the film, I should edit Buck out of the film. And now that I've released it on YouTube, I have good friends like Peter Boghossian and Helen Joyce and other people who have tried to connect me with podcasters and whatnot. And I've been on, Dave Rubin's show, a number of shows, but they won't touch it
because of Buck.
Because of Buck.
And the thing is, somebody like Buck Angel is, again, not someone I would agree with on almost anything, but that person has the capacity to reach people who would never listen to a political or religious conservative like me.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what I said during the Q&A at that private screening where we showed this. I said, I lived in Portland, Oregon for almost 20 years.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Happy to be out of it. But I'm always thinking of the people that I had conversations with there and what would appeal to them. I made another series on wokeness, and so I tried to walk people kind of hand in hand through why this ideology is bad and harmful, even for people who claim to be liberal and progressive. It's not what they think it is a lot of times. And so I'm always thinking, you're kind of playing the identity politics game a little bit by including somebody like Buck. But also, Buck is a really good spokesperson to speak out against this, precisely for the reason you mentioned. I'm not just interested in preaching to the choir. I want to get people who are on the fence or who, aren't really sure about this stuff to listen to these opinions. And I thought the best way to do that would be to include somebody like Buck. And so,
I think one of the most important things you've done in this film is frame it as essentially a religious phenomenon. I liked it when, I forget who it was, who talked about the trans phenomenon as a political religion. That is what totalitarianism is. It provides people with the sort of things that religion used to provide them with.
Right.
Whether it's Nazism or communism, it gives them a sense of purpose, of meaning, and of communal solidarity. And when you go read the stories from detransitioners, inevitably they will talk about how they went online and they found a community that cheered for them, that made them feel accepted, but that also provoke them to go further. You want more love, more solidarity,
right.
Then take it further.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've been interested in religion and religious ideologies and how these sort of new quasi-religions pop up and how they're sort of satisfying this need that I think human beings, I think it's clear that we have. Jonathan Haidt talks about this, even though Jonathan is also an atheist, is not religious, but is more sympathetic than, say, let's say like Sam Harris or somebody to religion, because it does fulfill a psychological need that we clearly have. I think the question is, how do we answer that for people who, some of these young detransitioners do turn to religion, do become Christian or seek out religion because they've had such a great loss and they're grappling with identity, and I think that's totally reasonable. But some of us, like myself, just won't believe. We don't believe these things. We don't think there's empirical evidence for them or whatever the reasons are. So I think there's a huge contingent of young people who they're not going to come to traditional religion. And so the question is, what do we do for those people? How do we point them towards a more constructive path? I think that's, as we talked about yesterday, is kind of like the quintessential problem that we face, in my view.
Yeah, and I think that maybe we could talk about the cultural matrix into which this sort of thing appeared, because it didn't come from nowhere.
Right.
And it's so outlandish, as the person commented, like, who could possibly believe it? But here we are. And as you and I were talking yesterday, I think that you have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century to understand the roots of this. The sociologist Philip Rieff wrote in the 1960s a well-known book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. Now, he was a biographer of Freud, but also a professional sociologist. His theory is that around the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly accelerated by World War I, people in the West lost their faith in a transcendent source of moral order. So what did they fill it with? According to Rieff, they filled it with what he calls the therapeutic approach, which is to say, we can never find ultimate answers, but what we can do is soften the anxiety that we feel in the face of the abyss. And Rieff wasn't necessarily endorsing this, he was just describing the society we have. So we find ourselves in a culture in which reducing suffering, and by suffering they mean anxiety even, that becomes the ultimate goal. And so when you hear these pro-trans people saying, would you rather have a living daughter or a dead son?
Right.
That's straight out of Rieff.
Right. Yeah, and that's interesting. I think not enough people talk about this. I think Jordan Peterson talks about it some. He talks about responsibility, but actually the importance of some suffering, right? I mean, an easy example is if you want to get in better shape, you exercise, and that is suffering. It's difficult. It's not easy. But the same thing can be said psychologically and characterologically. If you want to develop yourself, if you want to find some sense of purpose and meaning and really commit yourself to something, it's not going to be easy. But as you say, we've sort of taken this easy route, or we want to alleviate any sign of discomfort or suffering, I think that's wholly unhelpful in my view.
Right, and they just add to their suffering once they realize that they can't reach the utopia that they want via surgery and chemicals. It just adds to their distress, and seems to me that's one of the things that can explain the vehemence with which the trans activists and trans people press their case, because they must have everybody around them affirm them.
Right.
And that's why they will not tolerate any difference.
Yeah, and I asked a few people that question. Why, among this issue, are a lot of the activists so, vehement and even violent? Because you see that even more so than some of the Black Lives Matter protests. These people get so upset, and it's, I think, because they're brittle, because their view of reality, it's so far from reality. Men obviously can't become women. It's so fundamental and so basic that they don't have any good arguments against it, and so they don't have any way to react other than through the language of coercion and violence and having everyone affirm them, because it's so divorced from reality.
Well, when you see them screaming at others, even if it's just screaming in tweets, trans women are women, I'm reminded of the insights of the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote in the early 80s in his well-known book, After Virtue, that we have come to a point in our society and our culture and our civilization where there are no agreed upon bases for morality. And so everything gets reduced to what he called emotivism, which is to say, if you feel that it's true, then it is true. And anyone who contradicts you is attacking your identity. This is, he said this back in 82, and I think it was a really prescient observation, because this is what identity politics has done, and in nothing more pungently than in the trans debate.
Right, and that's where I think there's some interesting overlap between those of us who are not believers in traditional religion and those who are typically, and unless the particular Protestant or Catholic church has kind of gone woke, then they adopt this subjectivism and identity politics. But there's a huge contingent of us on both sides that do believe in objective truth. We may arrive at it a little bit differently at times, but I think that's what is missing in a lot of these ideologies, is that it's so subjective and it's so about this supposed lived experience, which is an odd, redundant phrase in the first place. But I think people have gone away from the fact that there are facts to know about the universe, and we can't just endlessly change our sex or identify as whatever we want and just have everything the way that we want. And what is so alarming to me is the way the practice of science, has been co-opted by this movement. You might remember, I think it was last year, that Rachel Levine, the transgender health department high official in the Biden administration... Woman of the Year.
What's that?
Woman of the Year.
Woman of the Year. Was discovered to have successfully used government power to lobby WPATH, which is the World Transgender Health Governing Board, into lowering the age at which they said it was fine for minors, for adolescents, to get surgeries and other treatments for political reasons.
Right.
It was against what science was telling these people, but Rachel Levine said it would be more politically advantageous to the trans people and trans advocates for WPATH to ignore the science and make a statement pretending that it was based on science, but in fact it was based on politics.
Right, and when it's convenient for them, they do resort to referring to some studies that they think are scientific, and this is the basis for why they want to do this supposed kind of care. But if you look into it a little bit, it's very clear that all of these studies are either shoddy or flawed or don't say what they claim to say. The quintessential example is the Dutch protocol or the Dutch study. Almost all of the transitioning of minors is based on this protocol. And I interviewed a sociologist who will hopefully be in one of the next episodes, Michael Biggs, who uncovered a lot of the flaws in this study. But some of the parts of the study where they would do follow-up questionnaires to boys, biological boys who identified as girls, and they would ask them questions like, are you bothered by menstrual cramps or your period any longer? And they would say no, and they would say, oh, well, this is evidence that this works. But they just mixed up the questionnaire. So, and one of the patients died from surgical complications due to the puberty blockers, and there are just so many holes and riddled throughout the Dutch study, and that is like the gold standard for these people. So even the science that they're supposedly referring to is all bunk.
One of the great unanswered questions, and it's raised in the film, is why the rest of us went along with this. And I think there are a few answers to that. First of all, as a professional journalist, I saw from the inside how newsrooms shifted over to embrace culture war from the left side wholeheartedly. I remember I was working at the Dallas Morning News about 20 years ago, and our newsroom took the stance that we will only write about gay rights. Trans wasn't really part of it then. We'll only write about gay rights from an affirming point of view. Now, this was in Texas, right? And in probably the most conservative big city in America, Houston might be the only rival. And yet the mainstream newspaper, the only newspaper in town, came down not on the side of a disinterested examination of the facts, of the arguments, but advocacy journalism. And I think that played a big part of it. When you could turn on morning television and see on the Today Show, the morning breakfast show in America, them interviewing, what was that? Desmond. Desmond is amazing. It was a drag queen, a 9-year-old drag queen.
Oh, wow.
And everyone in the audience there is clapping for Desmond. This sort of thing gets played over and over and over again. And I think this does a number in the minds of normies who think, well, I guess this is the thing.
Right. This is the new thing. This is the new frontier for civil rights. Yeah, and as I mentioned the other day, and as it's very common in left-wing politics, they say that you need to be on the right side of history, or you were on the wrong side of history. And so I think they have that kind of playing in their minds often. So that's perhaps what influenced these people to do advocacy journalism rather than just reporting the facts. I think that's often the case. They want to be the so-called good guys, right? And they want to, signal their virtues and their superior morality. So I think that plays a huge part of it.
I remember having a conversation once in the newsroom with a younger conservative of the millennial generation, and I said, come on, you're conservative. You know that the way we are approaching this whole issue is just not ethical from a journalistic point of view. And he said, well, I was too young for the civil rights revolution to write about that. This is our civil rights revolution. And I think that was a really important point to explain where the propaganda came from. And it's also the case that trans activists managed to lock this into the gay rights debate, such that if you were for gay rights, as most Americans were by the time of Obergefell, the decision legalizing same-sex marriage or making it constitutional, by the time that came along, most Americans were on board with gay rights. And so all the trans people had to do was say, if you're for gay rights, then you must be for trans rights.
Right. It seems like the logical next step to them, yeah. And it's really because they just haven't thought about it very deeply or critically. It doesn't take too long to think, to realize that, again, men cannot become women and vice versa. But somehow their psychology and the morality gets hijacked by these ideas.
And it's also the case that the dominant culture, the overculture, embraced identity politics across the board. So this is just one more part of identity politics. If you're going to embrace the legitimacy of a politics based on how you identify your race, your sex, or whatever, this just makes sense. It's one more identity category that is already, the basis for identity politics have already been accepted by those who set the tone for the culture.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
So the question that you and I both have and that vexes us is, what do we do about it? I think, and you might disagree, but I think based on what you've put on screen here, that we have to give people a chance or an opportunity to connect to something greater than themselves. There was a quote from Carl Jung saying, "This is what all people need." The question is, how can we do that? What is that something greater? Alistair McIntyre said that in the absence of an agreed upon basis, transcendent basis for our morality, you can have either a morality that's based on pure reason or the will to power, the Nietzschean will to power. I think that we are living right now through a time in which will to power is becoming more and more what people turn to because it makes emotional sense. A form of weak Christianity won't do it. The weak Christians are the ones who have, in many cases, embraced transgenderism for the sake of compassion, this sort of sentimental humanitarianism masquerading as Christianity. Even Pope Francis met often with trans people. Now, I'm not saying he shouldn't have met with trans people, but he did this on purpose, and he sent a signal. He wouldn't meet with Latin Mass Catholics, for example, which also sent a signal. So I would say that only a return to a strong form of Christianity would stand a chance at giving them something higher. But I also don't think that's likely to happen. I hope it happens, but I don't think it's likely to happen for reasons we can get into. But what do you think are some good candidates for the connecting to the transcendent?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that perplexes me often because I do think I think in order for society to function and for us to not devolve into some kind of authoritarian state, we need pluralism. I don't think that we'll ever return to something like a transcendent basis for all of morality because there are too many different ideas of what the transcendent means, of where it comes from, which God we're talking about. So I think it's really complicated, and I have none of these beliefs. So for me, what I like to at least encourage people to find and embrace, and I talked to a number of the therapists about this. I asked them what their ideas were to get kids out of this, and a lot of them said things like, they should get off their phones and go ride horses or join, community groups. And my solution is often for these people, do some kind of physically challenging activity that also unites you with a group.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Why is it important to get off the phones and get active in your body? How could that arrest a movement towards trans?
Well, there's a number of reasons. One is because there are so many YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram videos, et cetera, that push this stuff, and they make it seem like the trendy, fun thing to do, where in reality it's a very ghastly, horrible thing to do. So there's a bit of brainwashing, almost unorganized brainwashing that's sort of happening. There's a little bit of organization because these platforms will push this stuff, but sometimes that's just due to the algorithm, and it's complicated. But that's one reason. And another reason to get off the phones is, especially for kids, is that as we're developing physically and growing, we need challenges, as I was talking about earlier. And just sitting on your phone, you're isolated. You're not really making real connections with the real world and real people. And also being in one's head all the time, I think they start using avatars, they start thinking they could become something else that they're not. So there's a whole host of reasons, I think.
Yeah, I think that is a fundamental reason we have trans, and I think it's no coincidence that the incidence of transgenderism has skyrocketed in the first generation to be raised entirely within digital culture, precisely because it does disembody one. You're sitting there, and
right.
Your reality becomes what you see on the screen. And digital culture trains you unconsciously to think that all of reality is plastic, is malleable.
Right.
And it doesn't make logical sense, but it makes intuitive, emotional, and psychological sense to think that, well, if my reality, my concept of reality is formed by being online, then why shouldn't the rest of the world be forced to meet my needs?
Right, and affirm my identity, yeah. And to follow up on the previous bit, this idea of engaging in activities with groups that are challenging, where you often martial arts will do this for people, and I always encourage, especially kids should do martial arts or do something physically challenging like that. But also, I was talking to Douglas Murray about this when I interviewed him on wokeness, and we were talking about, well, what are the solutions to this? It's the same problem. This is just one contingent of wokeness. And he was talking about the idea of belonging to a nation. And he said in America, this could still potentially be one solution to this. So that is something greater than yourself. It does give you a sense of humility, because you have to think about the history, the country, not just yourself, sacrificing a little bit of yourself for others around you. So I think there are these kinds of components that also exist within traditional religion, but you can find them elsewhere. And so that's what I would encourage people to do. If they don't have these beliefs, like myself, then I do think they have to find this in pursuing other. It's not even so much about pursuing an identity as much as it is, excuse me, it's almost about transcending your personal desires and identity.
And as we were talking yesterday, the thing that really depresses me about this comes from a book I read recently, a brand new book called Why Religion Went Obsolete. And it was written by a man named Christian Smith. He's probably the leading sociologist of religion in the U.S. and is himself a Catholic. He teaches at University of Notre Dame. But he writes in this book that it's not just Christianity is declining. All traditional religions, at least in the United States, and I think this is true for Europe, they're all declining, and they're declining for a specific set of reasons, he said. If you look starting in 1991, that's when the collapse began, and it's been a steady collapse. He says, and I'm going to encapsulate his argument, he says that for people whose consciousness was formed after 1991, which is to say some of the millennials and Gen Z, they grew up in a culture in which they had fewer in-person encounters because they grew up digitally, and they would form communities or pseudo-communities online where they only reinforced each other's idea of what was real and what wasn't. So they lost the ability to even think outside, think critically. He says that globalization played a role because it sped up the economy such that people had to constantly be moving for jobs, and they couldn't form strong connections locally. So they lived in a kind of liquid economic atmosphere, and they also had to spend a lot more time at work. He says that radical individualism played a huge role. And this started long before the 90s, but when you have a culture that tells people that you are the ultimate authority and whatever you desire, you deserve. All of these things create a way of an epistemology, a way of seeing the world that, according to Smith, make the strong claims of traditional religion not only something they reject, but things that they can't even understand. Now, he says it's also the case that they're not becoming atheist. What are they doing? They are becoming syncretist, meaning they pull a little bit from this religion, a little bit from that religion. A lot of them are heavily into the occult to one degree or the other because they're seeking some form of transcendence, but not a form that requires them to lose control. Ultimately, this can't work, though, because it's just a therapeutic strategy for kicking the distress and the anxiety down the road. But what Christian Smith, again, a Catholic, wants people to understand, wants religious people to understand too, is that the kind of truth claims made by traditional religion are very hard for post-1991 people to even understand. And I think that this, taken outside of religion per se, but to try to look for the solution you and I would like to see, it makes it very, very difficult.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Shall we open it up to the audience for questions?
Sure. Do we have time for that? Yeah. Do we have another mic, or should we give
here,
her
I'll walk over.
Oh, I think we've got one there.
Oh, here comes the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, thank you for that fantastic film. That was incredible to watch and see. My name is Sean Nodley. I am a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. I started relatively recently, and I was actually a director on the Trump campaign. And my job was, I was one of the guys that got sent to deep blue areas, and my job was to flip votes from Democrat to Republican. And in doing that in the swing states, one particular area I really focused on was a place called DeKalb County, Georgia, which is right outside of Atlanta. And in it, there's a city called Decatur, which has one of the highest propensity populations of LGBTQ plus people in the South, if not the country. And one thing I saw as working for the Trump campaign was the trans issue was really pushing a lot of people in the LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual community towards Trump and towards voting for the Republican Party. And we just saw a swell of a growth of support to the point where, as a representative of the Trump campaign, I went to gay pride parade events, and they welcomed me with open arms, and they loved what I was doing in their community. My question for you is, do you think that maybe the trans ideology is starting to crack and it's starting to fall apart? Because that's sort of the sense of what I've gotten. And if it is, how long do you think it has left? And if it's not, how long is it here to stay?
Well, before we answer, can you give us an example of the kind of things lesbians and gays would tell you about why they were breaking for Trump over trans?
Well, there was a bunch of reasons. One woman who identified as bi came to my office and was incensed because she got some campaign, not officially from the Harris campaign, but some literature put at her door from a special interest group. It said, men have abortions too. And that deeply offended her. And we saw things like, you addressed it in the film, where people feel like, the trans culture is sort of usurping what they've tried to pursue in getting equal rights for gay persons in America, to where they think that, someone who is being conditioned to identify as trans might actually just be homosexual. It should be allowed to grow into their sexuality and stuff. And they liked President Trump. They would point out in 2000 when he had the Apprentice show, he had openly gay men on their program. And on his program says, some people like spaghetti, some people like steak. That's why we have menus at restaurants.
Trump is a New Yorker, so he's not gonna. Yeah.
So they really liked the fact that Trump was all about business, didn't care about your personal life, just wanted to do policies that are right for America. We saw a huge upswell from the gay community and all communities really across the board on that. And but they did cite the sort of this trans creep, I guess you could say, like the trans issues kind of overtaking everything that they seem to have fought and gained.
Right. So, Travis, is trans over?
I don't think it's over, but I think we're headed in the right direction. I mean, there have been a number of things that have come out recently, like the Cass report in the UK, which has shown what I was talking about earlier, that all of the supposed evidence for this is false. And it's a well-respected report, even though people are pushing against it. But there are other reports coming out, I think, of Australia and elsewhere. I think the U.S. is lagging behind a bit when it comes to this, but I've made friends with a lot of gay people. There's the Gays Against Groomers, which you might be familiar with, that are largely for Trump and very much against the trans phenomenon, because they think a lot of these people, which they are grooming young children into this. And I spoke with a number of people. I interviewed this guy, Mr. Menno, who makes content on this topic online. He's gay himself, and he mentioned that this is a deeply homophobic movement, and supposedly at GIDS at the Tavistock, who's the gender identity service, which is where they were doing a lot of this. Thankfully, it's been shut down recently, but there was supposedly an inside joke that was trans the gay away. So that meaning essentially that if you have this young effeminate boy who might be gay, what they do is they make him look like a girl, and therefore he's not really gay anymore, according to their logic. So I do think it's cracking, and I do think there is more and more support against the ideology. For some people, it will be here for a very long time. As Helen Joyce told me when I interviewed her, we'll stop talking about this in a couple of decades, but the people who won't, and it will continue to affect them, are the detransitioners because they've lost body parts or made really huge changes. So I don't think we should forget about those people. And there's also the contingent of people, the parents who push this on their kids. And they will probably never back down. I mean, maybe a few of them might see the light of day, but if you've made this decision for your, precious child, it's pretty hard to come back from that.
Yeah, and that's the thing that for me, it's the most puzzling thing about the entire phenomenon, is why parents went along with it. And not just parents of trans kids, but all the other parents who sit back and allow this junk to be taught in their kids' school because are they afraid of conflict? I just don't understand it. I used to think that when they come after the kids in the schools, that's when Americans will stand up. Didn't happen.
Right. No, unfortunately not.
I've seized control of the microphone, actually. The very first time I encountered gender identity ideology, I also heard what seemed to me a very decisive refutation of it. That decisive refutation was, it makes no sense to treat a psychiatric condition with surgery. Now, the man who said that was the professor of psychiatric medicine at Johns Hopkins University. I think his name was Paul Wies.
Paul McHugh.
Paul McHugh, I'm sorry, that's right. There is another man he was praising. Yeah. Now, he eventually, I think, was more or less bought out, wasn't he, of Johns Hopkins? Because, obviously, if they were committing themselves to this medicine, they didn't want an authoritative voice speaking out. And the other thing about it is, frankly, that refutation struck me at the time as both logically pretty sound and intuitively so. I mean, and it's the kind of thing you say, well, that sounds right to me. Maybe I better look and see if I'm wrong, and look at it more closely, but it sounds right. Why did that refutation, was it ever, in your view, decisively or seriously, critically examined and refuted, or apparently refuted? Or was it just, so to speak, forgotten? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think the retort is often, well, as was pointed out in the film, well, trans women, in other words, men, they have female brains, right? So it is physical. They will go to this level of saying, well, it is physical, therefore we need physical intervention. But again, as my interviewees discussed, just because you might have an odd brain or a hand that looks male when you're female, that doesn't mean that you have male hands as a female. So that again, I think is generally their retort, and that's what I've heard from a lot of people living in Portland, Oregon. They say, oh well, this is a real thing. You can be born this way. You can be born essentially with the wrong brain. And that gets to an interesting point about, well, how is this possible? Is it a soul? Is it a gendered soul sort of seated somewhere up there? But, yeah.
And I think this plays into a general sense in our culture since the 1960s that individualism is the paramount. It's at the center of our society, and nobody can tell you what's right or what's wrong for you. Christian Smith in the new book says why religion went obsolete. He said that Gen Z people will make moral judgments on their own, but they are deathly afraid to impose them on others. So they're terrified of conflict, and if conflict avoidance around these cases is built into the culture, then people will marginalize those who bring this conflict about, especially if those who are raising the objections can be portrayed as lacking compassion for the suffering gender dysphoric child.
Right. Right, and again, I think conflict we shouldn't really avoid it. It's actually often a good thing.
Yeah, I think that one of the now unknown progenitors of all this was very well known in his time. That was Otto Weininger, who wrote a book called Sex and Character, Geschlecht und Charakter, that was immensely influential in Vienna before the First World War. And it's a completely unreadable, dreadful book. But everybody, Wittgenstein, Freud, everybody in Vienna thought this book was wonderful. And what he argued, well, he argued a lot of things, but one of the things he argued is that he basically denied the distinction between sex and gender that this whole thing operates on, of course. But he was doing this before the First World War, and he said everybody is a man and a woman. And it's just that we're at different points on the spectrum. So therefore, you can sort of do anything. He himself actually committed suicide at the age of 23 in Beethoven's house. But that's another story. And I don't think it's coincidental that the first sex change operations, I think, took place in Vienna in the 1920s and 1930s. And then it moved to America, with all the Viennese intelligentsia basically decamped to the United States and to some extent to Britain. So I think that's another part of the whole story. Of course, Foucault made a huge move in this direction, denying the distinction between sex and gender as well. But it all, in a way, started, I think, with Weininger. But I think the answer to the question, why has this thing run rampant in schools and among young people? I think we also have to look at the way that children are, and I say children, I hate saying students, children in school, pupils, are encouraged to express their own views all the time. And this goes back to Dewey, who said the teacher is a facilitator, not an authority. So particularly in the public schools, state schools, the whole ideology is that the child must be listened to. And the teacher, this is thanks to Dewey, the teacher's authority has been wholly undermined. And I think until the authority of the teacher is restored, maybe we'll go beyond this transitioning, but there'll be another. Well, we now have a movement in Britain called Youth Demand that thinks they can go around blocking motorways and throwing paint on Van Gogh paintings, because they believe in the climate emergency. But it's youth demand.
Well,
I'll finish that. I think that's.
I would say now that we should question the authority of teachers, because in the United States, the class of educators have become the vanguard of this revolution. So I would, as a conservative, I would agree with you about the teacher's authority, but now the teachers are the bad guys in many cases in primary schools.
Yeah, and actually in Britain, they have refused to let parents see what they're teaching the children.
Right.
That happens in the U.S. too, as well, maybe to a lesser extent. Yeah, we did with Peter Boghossian and my friend Lyle Asher. We did a really great series on exactly what you're talking about and the change of education and why that's happened. But unfortunately, it is to the place where, I don't know. We need other institutions. We need better accreditation. It's a whole another can of worms.
Well, and I think one thing too, I doubt most ordinary people who talk about trans ideology are aware of this, but I'm sure it was effective among the elites. Magnus Hirschfeld was an infamous sexologist in Nazi Germany, or in Germany before the Nazis, and the Nazis drove him out, destroyed his Institute for Sex Research and so forth. He was a great advocate for homosexuality and transgenderism. So opposing transgenderism and all of that puts you historically on the same side as the Nazis, according to some activists. So I think that's an example of what René Camus calls the second career of Adolf Hitler. Hitler died in the bunker, but his example has been resurrected anytime someone wishes to advance a certain cause that Hitler opposed. They say, if you oppose us, then aren't you really on the side of Hitler?
I wonder what G.K. Chesterton would have made of all of this. I think he was reported to have said when people stop believing in God, they believe in just about anything. But, you add the power of social media into all of this. What really terrifies me is two things, really. One is the degree to which this trans ideology has spread so quickly over the last 20 years. And I think social media, plus the withdrawal of religious institutions, perhaps from having a slightly higher profile in our societies, has been a contributing factor to that. But there's something else that really terrifies me. I live in Britain. Well, I try and be in Hungary as often as I can. But it's the degree of institutional, cultural, and political power that is shoring up these kind of ideologies. Climate change is another one. But as far as this one is concerned, it really does have a detrimental effect on public opinion. People are genuinely afraid to voice their opinions. If you have a conventional job in the UK and you express an opinion in the workplace as to what a woman is, there's a very strong chance that you will fall foul of the HR policies there. And I just, and our friend over there touched on it in the context of America, but I just wondered whether you felt that actually, notwithstanding the fact that this ideology may have reached its high watermark, and any ideology that would logically result in the cancelling of the words mother and father from the lexicon is probably a bit vulnerable and on shaky ground. But do you see yourselves the emergence of a concerted response to this in terms of media, faith groups, political parties? I mean, in Britain, the political parties we've got have been conspicuously silent on this issue.
Yeah, I was talking with Rod yesterday about this. I did a number of interviews over in London and some in Ireland. That's where I did a majority of the interviews. And, Helen sort of joked that Britain was referred to as Turf Island because that's where a lot of the trans-exclusionary radical feminists come from. So there are some people speaking out against it. I interviewed Maya Forstater, who lost her job because she said this man was a man. Who claimed to be a woman on every third Wednesday or something ridiculous like that. And she actually got in trouble because it wasn't from the think tank she was working at in the UK. It was actually their sort of sister organization in the US that ended up complaining to HR about this, ultimately getting her fired, which is quite amazing. But just one note on that, I think, likely relevant to your film and your book, I think more and more people, regardless of the consequences, do need to speak out against it because that is how there's a sea change. And I've always encouraged people to do that when I was making my other series on wokeness and critical race theory and all of that. But you're right, there are real challenges. There are people who are working class who will lose their jobs or,
and be arrested. Our police interpret the law as to mean if a trans person complains about something that has been written or something that's been said, you'll get a visit. But can I just congratulate you, because I thought it was an excellent documentary, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the series.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Both Václav Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn took the position that if one is powerless in the face of totalitarianism, that one can't do anything effective politically because the system is too strong, one can at least refuse to live by lies. Yes. What did they mean by that? They meant that just don't sign anything that you don't believe in. Don't go to meetings where you can't speak the truth. There are all these small acts of resistance. Havel told this famous, it's now called Havel's Greengrocer. It's a parable that comes from his 1977 book, The Power of the Powerless. He said, imagine that you are a greengrocer in communist Prague. Everybody in town, all the small business people in town have a sign in their windows saying, "Workers of the world unite." Nobody believes it, but they put the sign there to avoid trouble. Well, what happens if one day a greengrocer takes the sign down? He says, "I don't believe in this. I'm not going to live that way." What happens to him? Well, he gets arrested. They take his business away. He has to go sweep streets for a living. There are real consequences to be paid. But the hope is that when people see that if you are willing to bear the consequences of your action and suffer for the truth, then they too will be either shamed or positively motivated to join you. This is the Buck Angel example. And over time, that can take down a system that depends on everyone being afraid to stand up to the lie. And I think that is one reason to hope. But I have to tell you, I have been so, as a religious person myself, I've been appalled by how so many churches have gone completely along with it. The Church of England is a disaster on this. And even religious leaders who are against it keep their mouths shut. I remember having a conversation once. I'm Eastern Orthodox. A few years back, someone in the church I was attending said to me at the coffee hour, said, "What is this gender ideology?" She had small children. She said, "I hear so much about it. I mean, what does the church say about it?" I said, "Good question." And I went to the pastor and said, "Listen, there's this issue. We need to talk about it at the congregation. Parents need some direction." The pastor shut me down, and he was a conservative. He said, "Nope, no politics in the church." I said, "This isn't politics. This is basic Christian moral living, and people need help. The church has something to tell them." He absolutely wouldn't have it, not because he agreed in any way with gender ideology, but because he was utterly terrified of conflict. And I think that is the Achilles heel of so many well-meaning religious people.
So I think we have to wrap up, but one more or two more quick notes on that same topic. When I interviewed Maya for the film, she said something interesting to me, which was a lot of people think out loud about how they would act in a totalitarian regime. And she said, "You know how you would act, you're doing it now." And so it's the same, the same thing. So, and just a funny note on that, I was out at a bar, I think in 2021, freshly after the George Floyd riots, which lasted 150 days in Portland. And I think I told these girls I was working on this documentary that's challenging this, and they just started talking about, "Oh, well, you know, we have white privilege and blah blah blah." And I had maybe a couple drinks already, and I just blurted out, "Well, I think that's bullshit." And then everyone, the mood totally changed. They're like, "Oh, we do too, actually." And so then everything changed. So as soon as the first person says it, then you realize how many other people think the same way.
Yeah, and I'll make one final point. We can close it down. I think parents are of ordinary people, not trans parents of so-called trans kids, but ordinary parents are also afraid of conflict with their own children. A few years back, I was in Slovakia on a book tour, and I met a man, a Catholic man, a conservative Catholic man, who said that his daughter was transgender, and it distressed him greatly. I'm like, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, we got her a smartphone for her 11th birthday because all the other kids in the class had smartphones. And we didn't realize it, but she made a connection rather quickly with some older teenagers in the United States, in Oregon, as a matter of fact. And they convinced her that she's trans and she had better make a decision about it soon before puberty kicked in." And he said that she fell into depression, she couldn't eat, she couldn't go to school, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, "Well, did you take her phone away?" "Well, no, she fights us tooth and nail to keep the phone." 2 years later, I'm back in Slovakia, I see the same man. I said, "How is your daughter?" "She's 13 now." "Oh, it's gotten even worse, and now she's medicating herself with marijuana." I'm like, "Oh my God, well, you took her phone away eventually, right?" No. They're too afraid of their own child. They're watching their child destroy her life, but they're terrified of losing their child's love, so they keep just hoping against hope that she's going to overcome this. Meanwhile, you've got an entire culture out there coming to her through this phone, that supports her in her delusion. And the parents are too afraid to make the simple but difficult. I've raised kids of my own. I know it's hard to tell kids, no, you can't. But they're abdicating their responsibility.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks to Rod. Really appreciate it. Thanks so
all.
much.